introduction. So tonight's presenter is Jim Preslicka. He's going to be doing Devonian Fossils from Independence, Iowa. Jim will be talking about a very fossiliferous layer discovered by the Blackhawk Gem and Mineral Society in the Middle Devonian rocks in the Bruning Products, I probably said that wrong, quarry in Independence, Iowa. This layer produces an abundant and diverse marine fauna, including many forms that are either unknown from the mid-continent area at the time, or previously only poorly known. The Blackhawk Gem and Mineral Society partnered with the University of Iowa Geoscience Repository to donate a large collection to allow for further study and research. Jim's presentation will focus primarily on the cephalopods as well as some of the fish material found there. And so I turn it now over to Jim.
All right, I'm going to try and figure out, is this meeting being recorded bar? Is that showing up on everybody's screen? I'm not sure if I can get that off of there. Let's see. Oops.
It's not on my screen.
No.
Yeah.
So it's just showing, okay, on my screen, it's got a big bar up there, but okay, sorry. I guess it's not showing up for everybody else, so that's good. All right, so greetings, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. Sorry, I've never done this over Zoom before, so it's going to take a little getting used to, but anyway, John knows that I'm a cephalopod addict, and I've been so for many decades, although not as long as John. But I was a student at the University of Iowa many more years than I care to admit, and I caught the cephalopod bug there from one Dr. Brian F. Glenister. I was fortunate enough to be able to learn from him, but right before he retired. And he's the one that got me hooked on these things, and I've been addicted ever since. Can't shake it. Right? Anyway, I'm sorry you're hearing tonight's talk from me and not him, but we'll give it a go anyway. An unusually fossiliferous bed was discovered by members of the Blackhawk Gem and Mineral Society back in 2007. And basically, like she said, it's been a joint project of the Blackhawk Club. And once we started finding enough material, we realized there's a lot of rare stuff here, a lot of unusual stuff, and the sheer volume of stuff the club recovered required some of it being, housed in a proper repository and so forth. So we partnered with the University of Iowa Geoscience Repository, and they have taken in the collections that the club has donated. So this is a specimen of one of the large nautiloids that was found by a club member, David Mall. You can see the camera bag there for size. So this thing is pretty big, a couple of feet from tip to tip. So where is this quarry? Right at the end of the green arrow in Buchanan County, kind of east central Iowa. Basically right on the eastern edge of the Devonian outcrop belt in Iowa. And I apologize for all the Illinois folks. My knowledge is very Iowa centric because that's where I went to school. So anyway, the shaded area is Devonian outcrop. And from the A all the way down to the B in the lower part of the screen there, basically, you find shallower water facies the further north you go, and then deeper water facies the further south and east you go. So once you get over into Illinois, you were generally speaking getting into deeper water in the Devonian Sea at the time. Again, here's the Iowa State bedrock map. Just as a general rule, the oldest rocks, generally speaking, are in the far northeast. Up in the corner there along the Mississippi and Wisconsin and Minnesota borders. And generally it gets younger the further south and west you go. And basically it's all sediments lapping up on the old dome up in Wisconsin. But anyway, the Devonian here is blue shaded stuff. And my home stomping grounds are in Johnson County, which I spent many, many hours as an undergrad. And then later on as a hobbyist, when I'd get an afternoon, we'd go out searching around the reservoir around here or some of the Coralville quarries. And John can tell you, but he knows when you go on a field trip to these Coralville quarries or to the reservoir, whatever, you can find cephalopods And you can occasionally find fish plates, that sort of thing, but in the case of the cephalopods especially, oftentimes you'll be looking all day and you have to break a lot of rock. And you might find, if you're lucky, you find, oh, there's one. And a few hours later, you might find another one. Or if you're really lucky, you might get, 3 on a given day or something, but it's few and far between. This place is the total opposite of that. This is the kind of this is, you're looking at the top down. This is the sandwich view, Devonian outcrop belt in Iowa. But the area exposed in the quarry I'm talking about is right at the end of the red arrow there. There's a tongue in the Solon member of deep water, the sea level high stand, and the fossils are associated with the edge of this maximum high stand. And the other thing of interest is, notice the independent shale fills. This quarry is riddled with karst features, caves and sinkholes and so forth. So here are the karst features. You can tell how big they are. So just by telling the comparative size of the folks walking here, this place, the wall is about 40 feet high, and you can see some of the caves go almost all the way to the top. But these things are important because the rock they want to get to for their quarrying operation is the limestones. They do not want the shale. Randy tells me when they drill down, this shale is not useful in their road aggregate. It gums up their machines. So basically they drill when they're getting ready to do a shot, and if they hit one of these pockets, they stop. And they have to basically get rid of the mudstone before they can do any more work. And this is important when it comes to the bench where we discovered all these fossils. So this is the north bench area. The layer of interest happens to be right at the top, that top red arrow, and about 3 feet or 1 meter above the Solon Davenport member contact, which is a very, very well-known formational and group contact. And it just so happens that this bench happened to be surrounded on 3 sides by those shaly pockets. So they were getting ready to drill and do a shot, and they would have blown this thing up, but they hit the 3 shaly pockets on the side, so they quit and left this bench intact. And had we known that there was a fossiliferous layer here and told them where to dig to it and stop, they couldn't have done a better job. Basically, they dug right down to the layer that had these things in it and stopped when they hit those shaly pockets. So it's like they exhumed the bedding plane exposure of this layer, and it was left there for the group to find. And it was in 2007 on a Waterloo Club field trip. They had two trips, a morning trip, an afternoon trip. So we were at Independence Quarry in the morning till about, it was from 9 to noon, I think, or something like that. And in the last 30 minutes of this trip, my friend said, hey, we always find lots of big brachiopods up in this top area, this bench area. So why don't we go up here and see if we can find any of these big sporiferids? Okay, we got 30 minutes. Sure, we'll go up there. So in all my hunting years, looking for cephalopods in this interval around my neck of the woods, we had determined that there were roughly 7 or so different kinds of cephalopod fossils you could find. Okay, and this is after years of collecting and lots of trips and lots of rock breaking. And we literally walked up on top of this bench in the last 30 minutes of this trip, and Glenn and I were looking for the sporiferids. And it's like looking around, oh, I don't see any sporiferids. Oh, but look, there's a nautiloid sitting here. Cool. Picked it up, set it over on the side, and took another step. And well, by golly, there's another one sitting there. Picked it up, put it over, made a pile. And then Glenn's like, well, there's one over here. Picks it up, and basically we spent the rest of the time there picking up loose nautiloids and made a pile in the last 30 minutes of this trip. And we found one of each of the 7 known species without swinging a hammer. So we knew right away that there was something unusual going on. And we definitely needed to get back in here. So thankfully, Glenn and Randy and the rest of the club set up some more field trips to this place to see what was going on here. So this is the top. So the very top part of this bench, just to try and give you an idea of the scale of this bedding plane exposure that we were working on. From about 2007 to 2017, the club would get in at least once a season or so, once every 3 or 4 months. And basically we spent the 10 years mining from one end to the other of this exposure. So this is what we would do, show up and get the crowbars and pry up big slabs and break the rock open and finding stuff like this. So here's Marv from the Cedar Rapids Club. A lot of you guys know him. Had just found a large coiled nautiloid here in place in this bedding plane exposure. And again, just to show you the scale of the size of this intact exposure, a couple of football fields in diameter, most likely. And the wall off in the background there is that 40-foot high wall that had the cave features on it to give you some idea of the scale. So this is a close-up. Why are these things concentrated here? What's going on? It turns out that this is a well-known contact, the Davenport below, which is a tidal flat environment. There's no fossils whatsoever. And you cross the boundary where the hammerhead is, and immediately the sediments start become chock-a-block full of fossiliferous material, brachiopods, corals, bryozoans, you name it, there's pieces and chunks in there. And the hard ground bed that we found these things associated with is right at the top there, where you can see a couple of folks working on the bedding plane up there on top. So there was a major sea level rise, and it turns out that the maximum high stand formed hard ground. So what this looks like when you see it on a fresh exposure, you know, you break a rock open or whatever, the black line on here is the hard ground. And this is basically a snapshot in time where the sedimentation that normally goes on in a limestone forming environment basically shut down. This massive sea level rise drowned all the sediment sources, shut down sedimentation for an extended period. And the only thing accumulating on the sea bottom were the shells and bones and hard parts of all the critters that were living at the time. So basically, anywhere in this quarry where you can get at this interval, there's a concentration of cephalopod shells and fish pits and occasional other things, lots of clams also associated with this. And not all of them are big. You can see the little nautiloid in here in the hard ground is, you know, just a little bit bigger than a penny. So here's that pile that we put together in the last 30 minutes of that first trip. We found all those chunks there without swinging a hammer. Of course, we cleaned up all the easy stuff. The rest of it was much harder to get out, but nothing 10 years of digging didn't fix right up. But it turned out there's about 13 species of cephalopods, which is off the charts for this age in the Devonian in this area, and 24 species of clams, which is way off the charts for diversity, 8 or so species of brachiopods, lots of fish debris, and other usual Devonian marine forms can be found as well. This again, just an idea of a hard ground formation. Normally, you have sediment constantly coming down like a little rain or snow. But when you get a hard ground formed, basically that sedimentation shuts down and the seafloor lithifies in place. And that's where you can get a lot of fossil concentrations sometimes can be associated. And then when the sedimentation kicks in again afterwards, it buries all the things that were at this hard ground interval. So sometimes you can get a concentration of good stuff. And this is a localized feature, but it does extend over something like at least 7 or 8 kilometers. Anywhere in this green circle, we found exposures at 3 working quarries. So the Brooks quarry is the BQ, Steve Miller quarry, and the Neiman quarry. So basically, anywhere in that green circle, this feature is persistent. So it's not just one small spot. It's spread over a larger area. We're not sure how far to the west it goes. The closest quarry off to the west is Jessup South, the JS on the left side of the slide. And that quarry is not quite deep enough, doesn't get down to the interval where this thing would be if it was there. And then going off to the east, the DQ and Quasqueton proper, the exposures there do not have this feature. So it disappears somewhere between the Neiman Quarry NQ and the Quasqueton proper QP. Somewhere in there, this hard ground feature disappears. And what was going on at the time, Iowa and Illinois there, you can see we're clustered around 30 degrees south latitude. And the red arrow points to the approximate location of the Brooks Quarry and the Independence hard ground. So again, land, the old transcontinental arch was off to the north. And generally speaking, deeper water environments are encountered as you move to the south. So going off into Illinois and point south, we've been getting into fairly deep water. We geologists love modern analogs. What might the Devonian have looked like? Well, the closest place where limestones are forming in the modern day is South Florida Bay, the little triangular shaped area between the Rock Keys and the Everglades, or the red arrows pointing to, is where lime muds are currently accumulating and probably eventually will form limestone one day. So here's a picture of the 1993 spring break trip, University of Iowa class. And you can see the boat and the deeper water in the background. The water is a little bluer, so that's like 15 feet deep. And then it comes right up to sea level where we're walking and sinking in the mud. And this is what the area in Iowa and Illinois might have looked like for much of the Devonian. And this is what happens when you walk on unlithified muds. So this stuff, he wasn't smiling for too long after this picture was taken. These muds are full of broken shell bits and pieces of coral and lots of sharp things. And basically this is like taking a Brillo pad bath, kind of. And what are you standing in? Oh, it's salt water. Yeah, so you know, shortly after this, all of us were in great pain. And then we understood why they had offered to sell us full-length wetsuits for the duration of this trip. And the rest of the trip after this first day, we all got the bodysuits. Let's just say doing this in shorts turned out to not be a great idea. So when I say cephalopods, the modern form, the living one that is most similar to all the fossil forms is the nautilus. Just to give you an idea what these things might have looked like when they were alive. Notice how it hangs around near the bottom and it's using its tentacles to feel along the bottom. It's looking for bits of detritus, bits of food to pick up.
Yeah, that's a very young nautilus.
Yep.
In fact, it like you can almost see where it hatched if it turns around. Turn around, sweetie. There you are, right there. Well, I can't. But yeah, that's a very young nautilus. And they do hang at the bottom. And they are incredibly cute.
Very much so.
Come on.
Very cute. So it's called a living fossil because this is the one that is most similar to the fossil forms that we find. So why do we call it the chambered nautilus? Well, here's a cross section of it. You can see the shell is divided on the inside by multiple chamber walls and the siphuncle and whatever, basically dividing the shell with the chambers there. But I like to think of these things as like jello molds or cake pans. The shells are great when the animal's alive, but when it dies and this falls to the bottom and gets buried, the shell tends to dissolve rather quickly, geologically speaking. So oftentimes you only find a mold. So you find the sediments that were filling the inside of the shell or the outside, but internal or external molds, you almost never find the shell intact on these things in the fossil record. So what did the nautilus of the Devonian look like? Well, here's one. This one was found at Independence. And the rocks there roughly are about 385 million years old, give or take. And this thing is essentially the same size and shape, same coiling type, and even the opening of the shell is kind of subrectangular. It looks a heck of a lot like a modern allonautils. But you can see the chambers dividing the shell. It's got a little ribbing preserved in there in one corner, and the siphuncle, much like the modern ones, is almost dead center on these things. And basically this is an animal that found a mode of life that worked really well for it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And they've been keeping on through multiple mass extinctions that wiped out all other things, you know, wiped out ammonoids, wiped out all the rest of the nautiloids, wiped out the dinosaurs, yada, yada, yada. And the nautilus is still trucking along. We also find a lot of orthoconic nautiloids at this place. And to give you an idea of what those might have looked like, modern analog is a school of longfin squid swimming out by Cape Cod. Notice the torpedo-shaped bodies, they swim backwards, yada, yada, yada. And look at how many of them there are. What does that sort of look like in the Devonian? Well, here's a slab, chock-a-block full of almost nothing but orthocone nautiloids, and they're pointed every which way. So random distribution in this, so they're not being concentrated by steady currents, anything like that. It's just a random accumulation, all different orientations in these things, but in this case, this rock had a couple dozen of these things on it. So this gives you an idea of why we call it a concentrate horizon. And for diversity, this was a slab found by David Malm, the fellow I mentioned at the beginning. But again, there's a camera bag that's about 6.5 inches tall. And there are 4 nautiloids contained within about 2 feet on this slab that he flipped up from the bedding plane where this hard ground is. The big one there we call the football oncocerid. The coiled one off to the right, that's one of the nautilus-like ones. And then there's 2 of the short bullet-shaped ones down below. So 4 different kinds within a couple of feet of each other. So then this kind of diversity is really unusual for the Devonian. Usually, you know, you find 1 or maybe 2, they're usually the same kind. It's very unusual to find this many different kinds in such close proximity. So it turns out the most common, or I should say the most dominant in number of species at this place are the oncocerids, which these are kind of the last of the lineages that they're much more common in the Ordovician. Lots of them show up in John's faunas way back when. Well, we've got 6 different kinds in this one picture here, all oncocerids, and they range, you know, from a couple inches long to the biggest ones will be the size of a football. And the 3 small ones here, basically, you only find them associated with this hard ground. They do not turn up anywhere else in Iowa. The bigger ones you can find pretty much throughout the Devonian outcrop belt. So the little ones seem to be special.
Jim?
Yes.
Yeah, one point. Maybe some of you are thinking, well, in the Mississippi and in the Pennsylvanian, there's places where there's just chock-a-block with these. Well, no, they're chock-a-block with ammonoids, which were, when they finally popped up, much more common. This fauna right here is about the time when ammonoids were first getting started.
Yep.
So you're dealing with mainly nautiloids, which I have no problem with, but there are ammonoids here, and later on, I mean, down in Oklahoma, you get some of this Caney shale, and you can break it open and there'll be a 20, 30 ammonoids just spill out.
Yep.
But they're ammonoids. They live by a different set of rules.
Right.
And some, you know, when I go through my program, some of you remember that. So you got to realize this is for Devonian, this is incredible right here for the number of critters, of nautiloids.
Yep. And these are kind of this hard ground cephalopod assemblage includes a lot of kind of last hurrahs of holdouts like these oncosaurids, and also the first of the new things that would eventually take over later cephalopod beds, like the nautilus-like things and the ammonoids and so forth. So you kind of have a nice mix of the old leftovers that were still hanging on, and then the new things that were getting ready to take over. And this is another, as it turned out, unusual one. I apologize for the slide being out of focus. I always intend to take a better one, and I forget to do it every time I give this talk. But anyway, this looks like your typical orthicone nautiloid, which is the most common thing we find there. But this guy actually turns out to be a very rare thing. Basically, we would pick up on field trips all the specimens we could, and once you get a few of the orthocones, you're like, we'll throw it in the kid bucket, because that's what goes to the kids' fossil dig pit at the various club shows. So we would throw all the broken orthocones and whatnot in the kid bucket thing. Well, Tom Bloom, the president of the Blackhawk Club, was going through the kid bucket one time at his home, getting ready to take stuff to one of the rock shows. And he picked up one of these pieces here and noticed, oh, it's flat on one side. That's a little unusual. And it happened to be broken. And he looked and saw the siphuncle, the tube that goes through all the chambers in these things, was not in the middle like it's supposed to be for your typical orthicone. It was closer to the flat side. It's about 1/3 of the way from the flat side, 2/3 away from the rounded side. And there's a little saddle on the sutures, which you can sort of see in my terrible photograph, but it turns out he went through the rest of the bucket and the rest of the stuff he had at home and found, oh, here's another one with the flat side and the bent sutures. Oh, and the siphuncle is off center. So he called me up and said, hey, I think I found something different. Why don't you go through all the orthocones you have at the repository? So sure enough, went through, after he showed me one of these things, went through the collections we had housed at the repository, and it turns out about 1 out of every 100 orthocones or so was one of these things. So that kind of shows why multiple sets of eyes are a good thing, and repeated collection trips, so you pick up the rare stuff, because this thing, as it turns out, has not been described from this hemisphere, not just this continent, but this hemisphere. It's described, according to the treatise, as being from Asia, this thing. So it's a new member of this family that I won't try to pronounce, but it's actually an oncosaurid. It's not an orthosaurid of the typical kind. So this is actually a 7th oncosaurid species at this place. And these are the most eye-catching ones, the gyrocones. So you can see the Swiss Army knife for scale. The biggest ones of these things get to be about 2 feet across. And the one on the left, when Tom found it, was only the shoulder, the upper part was exposed. The rest of it was encased in a block of limestone, but he knew the whole thing was likely there, so he took it to his friend in Waterloo that does prep work, Jack Peterson. Spent 80 hours with the pneumatic chisel and exposed the entire wonderful, gorgeous looking gyrocone that you see on the left. Excuse me. So that's what 80 man hours of prep work looks like. And then it turns out these things have a highly variable coiling type. It may be that we have 2 different species. We were trying to spitball why some of them almost touch, like the one on the right, and then other ones are wide open and never come close to having the whorls in contact, like the one on the left. But from what we've been able to find out, it's likely that this is probably one species, and they're just highly variable in coiling. So for whatever reason, tight coiling or loose coiling didn't matter a whole lot, and they varied a lot from one individual to the next. They have a very small body chamber for this huge shell, so it's a real puzzle as to what these things were, what their mode of life was. but it actually turns out these are most widespread in the Devonian outcrop belt in Iowa. You can find them all the way from the far southeast up into the shallower water stuff in the north central. So these actually would make a pretty good guide fossil. They're big, relatively easy to identify when you find even a chunk of one, and they have a very limited range, limited only to the lower Solon member in this area. And as John had mentioned, there are ammonoids in this stuff. It's one of the reasons I joined the club and hopes to get to go to one of the quarries in Independence, because there were 3 of these specimens known in the University of Iowa repository collections prior to the club's work. And one of them had been found in Independence. So that was one of the things I was hoping to eventually find at this place. I'd looked and looked and looked for these for years in the rocks around here and could never find even a chunk of one. But sure enough, like John said, that first trip there, he split open a rock. Hey, you got that one handy, John? Can you hold it up for folks to see? He found this one on the first trip there when he split the big slab open. That big beauty. That's better than the holotype. So, and it turns out this is Iowa's oldest known ammonoid species. And up till this point, only 3 of them had ever been found that were known. And the biggest ones, they're basically all around 5 centimeters in diameter. Well, look at this one. Basically as big as the holotype. John's is bigger. We found some as big as 10 centimeters across, the absolute largest. So there's a strong hint that they may be dimorphic. So the bigger ones would likely be females, and the smaller ones are likely males, assuming they follow the usual ammonoid pattern. The females tend to be the larger ones. So we might have an early case of a macroconch and microconch here. But just by finding that one ammonoid basically pins you down very quickly. They do make good guide fossils, especially this one. This has a very limited range, only the lower Solon member. Doesn't show up anywhere else. The problem is it does not occur very widespread. So basically all specimens are known from only 3 counties in Iowa. So it appears this one was an endemic species, for whatever reason, specialized to live in the area around Buchanan County, Lynn County, and Johnson County. And basically you go anywhere else, you do not find them. But just by finding those in this one place, basically this is a list of lower Devonian settlements on the left, all the way up to the top of the Devonian on the right, and the red arrow points to the onlap, the maximum sea level high stand associated with the tectonic onlap. Basically the red arrow is, or when you find this thing, you know you're in that little snapshot of time in the middle Devonian 2 there. Other things that we find, this is a real problematic fossil. It may be a gastropod, it may be a cephalopod, I'm not sure. Things like this in the repository have been identified as Tylodiscosaurus, a nautiloid that's known from the Mississippian. They sure look a lot alike, but these don't ever preserve any obvious sutures. Can't see a siphuncle. Chances are we may have to section some of these and polish them in hopes to see some internal structure, if there's any chamber walls or not. But these may actually be gastropods, even though they look a heck of a lot like a cephalopod. But there are other things besides cephalopods at this place, including the wonderful placoderm arthrodire fish, the armored skin jointed neck. These are some of the keystone predators in the Devonian. And basically the front half is covered with bony armor plating. And they're basically swinging around. The biggest ones of these got to be the size of a school bus. And they were capable of opening up their jaws to about 180 degrees to then bring them down in a massive shearing bite to try and basically cut through the armor plating of their prey, which is other fish, or the hard shells of the cephalopods. But basically, this thing had to have massive bite force to puncture through the armor or the shells of the thing that it was chasing. So here's a reconstruction of a skull. I think this one's from Ohio. We obviously don't find anything this wonderful, but mostly you'll find an individual piece of the jaw or one piece of the armor plating. You never find anything articulated. Always an isolated bone or piece of the skin plating. And this is a piece of the skin plating, the black bumpy stuff on the lower left of that slab. And my photo doesn't do it justice again, but if you go from where the black fish plate is sticking out, there was a crevice that goes all the way up to where the chisel is in the back that was black. And assuming this whole thing was one plate, it would have been almost 3 foot long. So this would have been a huge chunk, but again, probably only one piece of the skeleton, not the whole thing. But if you picture one piece being 3 feet long, gives you an idea of how big the whole thing was. And it's thought that these bumps or some sort of sensory input for the animal, something akin to the jelly-filled pores in sharks. So the bumpy stuff would help it hone in on where its prey was. And this is a piece of one of the jaws. Now, again, these aren't the school bus size ones, but you see the point there. There's 2 of these points on the bottom and 2 on the top, like you can see on the jaws of this guy here. And they don't have teeth per se. Basically, their biting surface is their jawbone, but it's honed to a knife edge. And every time it bites, it's sharpening its jaws for the next bite. So each bite is like sticking a knife in a knife sharpener. So again, there's the little cusp of one of these things. Now this next thing is from the TV show Walking with Dinosaurs. I'm going to turn up the sound. I hope you guys will be able to hear it. But basically, this is where Nigel is the host and his buddies have built a time machine, and they're going back to the Devonian, and they're getting in a shark cage, and they're going to swim with the Dunkleosteus, okay? Now, we were discussing some of this before the meeting, and we're like, you know, Catherine pointed out, those bars are way too wide. There's too much space between them, and I don't think they're thick enough. I would want a much better cage. I don't think you could pay me enough to get in the ocean with these things. But anyway, here goes. And Nigel has a bet with his buddies. I think these things can bite through chainmail. Oh, I don't think so, whatever. So they're gonna, you know, put chainmail around some bait. So here goes.
The next encounter takes Nigel back deeper into the past to meet the armored fish of the Devonian, predators that are quite literally as hard as nails.
Unbelievable. How was the dive, Mike? Oh, outstanding. Have you got one? Did you see one? I saw it. It came so close. I'll get this in the machine. Okay.
Cameraman Mike, he did a reconnaissance dive just to see what was around. And from what he's saying, we've actually struck gold on the first dive. Exactly what we came here for. Oh, that's it. Can't be anything else. A Dunkleosteus. Well done, Mike. I mean, what was it like? That's like a real Leviathan there.
My heart was in my mouth. Just took my breath away.
And that thing is over 30 feet long. Must weigh 4 or 5 tons. That's as much as 2 or 3 elephants. Let's pause it. Have a look at this. What a fearsome head. This shows the classic features of Dunkleosteus. Armor plating on the front of the body. That can be up to 2 inches thick. And look at that mouth. Those aren't teeth. Those are extensions of the jaw bones. They're for shearing through the prey. And this thing has to punch through other armored fish. And those jaws are backed up by powerful muscles at the back of the neck there. Look at that. And this is exciting. If this stays around, it's going to be my turn next. And we're going to find out how powerful those jaws actually are.
Again, this cage.
This is where you feel like you're most vulnerable. Actually swimming into the cage with a great chunk of bait. It's coming straight towards us. See that really thick protective armour on the head there. Over 2 inches thick. Only the first third of the body's covered with that. Look at that. These fish have got these massive jaws with big sharp shears sticking out. And what they do is they slice them together just like scissors working. The very action of slicing them together keeps them sharp. And with that they can cut through anything. See, with my bet. This is no vegetables tail. This is a monster.
That's the last thing a lot of Devonian critters ever saw. The mouth of one of those things opening up.
Slam the cage again. This is getting serious. He really wanted the cage. Dented the bars there. He really wants this bait. I want to win the bet I had with the crew. This sea monster, I'm sure he can slice through chainmail. Look at that, he's coming closer. Let him wrench my arm out of the socket. And it is chopping through that, slicing through it, chainmail and all. And I have won my bet. There's a little Dunkleosteus here, right underneath me. He's looking for little tidbits. These armoured fish, they flourished for around 50 million years, then all of them became extinct. Listen to that. It makes you shudder. The big predator is crunching through that juvenile, crunching through the plate. The Dunkleosteus was certainly showing its true form. It's not just a predator, it's a cannibal as well.
And it's about to show you why we only find isolated pieces.
And as for its table manners, believe it or not, this is normal behaviour. The Dunkleosteus isn't being sick, but a fish like this that feeds on armoured food needs to get rid of the indigestible bits, and it's regurgitated the bits of fish armour, and in this case the chainmail, and this is perfectly normal.
So those are waiting to be buried at the sea bottom and then found in a few 100 million years by some enterprising fossil collector. But again, you can find that on YouTube. If you want to watch more of that show, it's pretty good stuff. And again, getting back to the sheer volume of stuff we found at this site, this is the floor of my single car garage after one trip. And we would call it a repository dig, where basically all the members that went that day knew that they were going to turn over almost everything that they found to the repository collection. So this is one trip's worth of stuff, divided with the name of the donor on the index cards on the left side, and then all the stuff they donated that day. So this is one trip, and you can figure we did this several times a year over the course of 10 years. This gives you some idea of the sheer bulk of the stuff that has been donated. So what do the collections at Iowa look like? On the left is the ammonoids that we mentioned earlier. The ones on the left are the three that were known prior to the Blackhawk Club's work. after the Blackhawk Club has dug at this site for 10 years and donated, there's approximately 150 specimens in the repository collections now, as opposed to the 3. And again, many of them are much larger and better preserved than the 3 that were known prior to the club's work. It's something that gives you an idea of type specimen, which is the guy on the upper left, versus type population, where you can have enough specimens, you can pick up on variances in size and so forth. And actually, as it turns out, the 3 that were known were probably all microconchs, males. And they just happen to have not found any of the macroconchs, the females, which we have many of in the drawers there. The small things that may or may not be nautiloids, the Tylodiscosaurus ? That might be a gastropod, might not. They didn't have any in the collections. Now there's 4 dozen, some of which, again, will have to be probably cut and polished to see if there's any internal structures preserved. The small little bullet-shaped guys, again, before the Blackhawk Club's work, they had none in the collections from this time frame. Now there's over 230 of several different specimens, probably a few different genera as well. The repository building itself is basically stacked to the hilt. They've been collecting stuff for 150 years. They don't have room for big things. So she had to give us storage out in her satellite warehouse. So again, just to give you an idea of the bulk, down on the lower left was kind of when we started, and then on the lower right is what it looked like just before we moved it all to a new building. So it was basically floor to ceiling, and this is all of the gyrocones and the big oncosaurids and the big nautiloids, the coiled ones that look like the Nautilus. Basically, it's floor to ceiling and cabinets full of these things. And now they've moved to a different building, which is in much better shape. Was actually built in this century as opposed to the previous century, and the roof doesn't have holes in it, and the heater works, and it doesn't leak every time it rains. And anyway, but you can see the ladder for scale, and again, these are 8-foot shelf sections here, and there's 3 of them basically full of specimens that were donated by the club over the course of 10 years. So with that, I will close by thanking the members of the club, and especially in particular, Randy and Denise Reed. Randy was the former quarry foreman at the Bruning Quarry, and without his help and Denise's help, a lot of these specimens never would have come to light. And now there is a very large collection at the University of Iowa that is available for study and cataloging and so forth. And we're gradually trying to work through it. We have published a couple of short papers, but we'll be going back through and describing the ammonoids again and some of the other species. But with that, I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
My first question is, how can you sneak me into this quarry?
Well, it would be a lot easier if Randy hadn't retired, doggone it. But we haven't tried. I don't know the new person, so we'll have to see if we can get in touch with him. The other 2 quarries where this stuff occurs have been recently merged with a company that the Blackhawk Club has a good relationship with. So I think once they get those, what do I want to say? They're still in the process of merging. So they've just taken over these 2 other quarries, but I think there's a good chance eventually that Sherm Lundy will be able to get us into the other 2 quarries, because his company has a good relationship with the Blackhawk Club. So I feel positive about getting into the other 2. I don't know about getting back into the Brooks Quarry.
So I have a question on the, and I'm probably going to say this wrong, the gyroconic
Yes.
nautiloids. So what are the advantages and disadvantages to having the shells separated? And did it separate more as it aged, or were some, why would their shells being separate like that, the whorls, what would be the advantage or disadvantage?
Good puzzle. these things would have been really terrible swimmers, front to back, like the Nautilus likes to swim. However, the wide open coils would make this a very stable swimmer for going up and down in the water column. So our suspicion is that these things were in the plankton, basically floating and filter feeding, and maybe they basically wanted to go up and down in the water column instead of front to back. And they have these huge shells, and the body chamber, I mean, is the red arrow points to where the body chamber starts on this thing. You know, you've got a 2-foot shell, and this last few inches is the body chamber. So you have this teeny tiny animal compared to this huge giant shell. So this thing would have been a really a terrible swimmer. But again, it would have been very stable for going up and down in the water column. So
It's just weird. I mean,
it's a real puzzle. But again, we think this one may have been floating in the plankton, you know, always in the photic zone near the surface. And that's probably why these things are so widespread in the outcrop belt, because their shells could be distributed by currents of either air currents or sea currents. And that might explain why you find these things all through the outcrop belt, even in the deeper water stuff, all the way up to the shallow water stuff. These things got around at the time.
is there any evidence of what they're feeding, you know, what their mouths or look like as far as similar to other, you know, the more coiled nautiloids?
Nope, we don't have any special preservation, no soft parts, and don't believe anybody's found anything that, I mean, they would look like little clam shells if you happen to find the radula or something. But as far as I know, I don't think anybody's ever turned one up. Nothing that was recognizable as a radula or jaw part anyway. And they also have 4 rows of nodes, so you can kind of see one on the curl of the one on the left there. There's bumps about every 3 or 4 chambers. There's actually 4 rows of these nodes, so these would have been some kind of ornament or bumps along the shell. And again, that would have probably made it an even worse swimmer, at least front to back.
I have another question. Did gastropods feed on nautiloids? Because I don't think I've ever seen a nautiloid with a hole in it, but I'm wondering if they were possibly preyed on by gastropods.
Well, I suppose they'd at least be scavenged on after they died, perhaps, but I don't know. John, you got any thoughts on that?
No, gastropods would not be able to do these guys. However, other nautiloids or fish could easily crack the living chamber and suck out the guts and then just leave the shell go. So sure, they were. Every animal is preyed upon.
Well, yeah.
And but I would say it would have to be more likely other nautiloids or more likely fish.
Okay.
Now, you know, and there was a great variety. Nigel concentrated on Dunkleosteus because it's the largest and most spectacular. That's what Nigel does. I mean, he's there for one reason, to sell his show. He did, I don't know, Jim, if you remember, but he did one on the Ordovician where he had an Orthoceras shell, not an Endoceras shell, an Orthoceras shell, and that son of a gun was 10 times bigger than anything I've ever seen.
Yeah, you got to take some, you know, editorial liberties there.
Well,
In the audience, right?
why not? But no, you see, modern Nautilus has cracks in its shell. Mainly at the time it got cracked was at the living chamber, and some animal was trying to get the meaty part. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I've got Nautilus shells here that have damage to them, but they survived,
Yep.
so they got away. But
up there.
drilling with a
Mhm.
That one's got a big-
gastropod, I'd say not at all.
that one's got a big bite mark on it there.
Yeah,
Something.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
But it didn't kill it. So the nautiloid managed to get away. You can see there's some more bites on the other side, probably
Yeah.
with that same attack.
No, that's a more mature shell. You can tell because of the white venter right there. Nautilus has what they call counter shading. Yeah, the top part that Jim's showing right now, the pattern is not uniform. It breaks up its profile when a predator is looking at it from the top. It blends in with a substrate. Then on the bottom,
Underneath it,
when you're looking at it from the bottom up, it's blending in with the sunlight of the top layers of the ocean, and that would be it would be virtually invisible. It'd be like having a cloaking device because it would blend in so well. It's just a way, and Ordovician shells had those too. We've got and Devonian.
our chances are
From Michigan, they've got Devonian that have lines on them. I've got several over here that have lines on them on the dorsum, the back, not the venter. And it's called counter shading, and it's just a matter of camouflage. It works adequately, works real well with Nautilus, but
that's
and
a-
there's an interior of and you can look at it and you say, you know, it hasn't changed in 500 million years. It still has a siphuncle and chambers and removes the liquid. Yeah, there's it. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
section of
It's just
shell that shows the siphuncle. The tube goes all the
yeah.
way. So that
Now
is a buoyancy.
Nautilus siphuncle is extremely small. But it does what it and there's more to it than that about removing the fluid, and no reason to get into it now. Back in the day, especially in the Ordovician, the siphuncles were sometimes 3/4 the size of the shell itself in endosauroids. So, but yeah, you know what Jim shows you, the architecture of Nautilus is exactly the same as the architecture of Ordovician or Devonian nautiloids. Hasn't changed.
Here's the one that was in that slide.
Yeah, that's a beauty. That's a beauty right there.
The one is on again. You take it apart.
Here's one. Here's one from the Jurassic.
Siphuncle right in the middle.
Oh, yeah.
This is the Jurassic. This is uh, a um, a nautiloid that made the transition from Triassic to Jurassic, Sinoceros, and you can see that if you look at it, it's pretty. Yeah, I mean, come
Yeah.
on, come on. Like Jim
Yeah.
said, if you've got an architecture, if you've got a ball plan that works, why in the hell would you want to change it? So it's exactly the same. And I'm betting if you went back to the Jurassic, Triassic, those coiled nautiloids would have that counter shading on them. You know,
Yeah.
yeah, you don't get the shells of these that often. But I'm betting it would look very similar to Nautilus. You look down and say, "Oh, that's a Nautilus." Well, no, it's not. It's a relative, but it's not Nautilus. So it's just that's what makes cephalopods. What got me interested in, and I'm sure Jim too, is not only are they just spectacular animals, but their architecture, their bow plan is so much more sophisticated than any other animal that lived, especially in the Ordovician. Now they had competition in the Devonian with the fish, but the architecture of a nautiloid, what it has to go through is just orders of magnitude above any other invertebrate.
This
So which is that one, Jim?
one of the big oncosaurid.
Yeah.
This is the one we call the football oncosaurid, just because it's about the
Yeah.
size of a football, and some of them look a lot like one.
And the group, the order Onchocerida, extremely diverse, like Jim said, really diverse in the Ordovician. I mean, you've got what, Jim, 7?
7 in this fauna.
Yeah,
out of the
I've
13.
got 9 species of Beloidoceras alone to show you how diverse they were. But that order, Onchocerida, eventually led to Nautilus. So the two that Jim showed, that one just now and the Nautilus, they're related. They are related.
Kind of like a cousin.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Although certainly Nautilus is much. My God, yeah. Any of the coil. See, the advantage to coiled, you have the chambers, the air chambers above the animal. You don't need any deposits like the straight shelled ones. They have deposits to keep them horizontal, but not. Let's see that one Jim's showing right there.
Center of-
Yeah, there's the. It's
center
like
of
a hot air balloon. There's the chambers that have the air in it, and down there is the living chamber where the critter is right underneath. It's just marvelous engineering. Just marvelous engineering.
swim with a little bit of a rocking action, like you
Yeah.
guys saw Nautilus in the movie. There's just a little bit because the center of buoyancy isn't quite the same as the center of mass. It's
Exactly. Actually,
a little bit.
probably the straight shelled ones, even with their deposits, could probably swim better than Nautilus can. But Nautilus is still here.
Yeah.
So it something it had a some trait, something. It's like what was it? Stephen Jay Gould said, contingency. Why did the nautiloids survive and the ammonoids did not? Something about that was just normal biology proved to be the thing that saved them. And I will talk about that at next year's expo. So there. You need to
I-
show up in May. You need to show up in May.
Next May.
Well, I don't want to like stop other people from asking questions, but I've got a couple more. Stepping aside from nautiloid to the fish, the placoderm, the front part of it was plating, but the back part, did it have denticles in the back?
That I don't know. The back part was basically all muscle because it had to have enough
Yeah.
power to move the bulk. The front, that armor plating obviously is very heavy. And, you know, when you're talking about the size of 30 feet in diameter or length, whatever, there's a lot of mass to move. So this back half is all muscle. I don't myself know what.
Yeah, I don't. I'm not. Obviously, I'm not a fish person, except when I would go fishing for muskie. That's another story. But I'm not sure, Jim. I'm not sure the posterior end has ever been fossilized, has it?
Not to my knowledge, no.
No, I'm assuming they had to have a backbone to move everything. But I don't know. Maybe somewhere there is one, but the front part.
Well, I mean, like even with the sharks, the denticles are very, very small. So, have they just not matched it to that, have they, that's what I'm curious about is what would be the, denticles? It seems that that would make sense, but
Something there. You might need a real special preservation.
well, it's somebody's PhD is right there, their thesis, dissertation.
I mean, the tough, thick armor plating, obviously, that's resistant enough. That can readily fossilize, but that back stuff, if it was easily fossilized, a lot of that probably would have been turned up. It would have been more well known. So, I don't know.
So they've never found a fossilized one, a complete fossil of one that would show that?
To my knowledge, the most complete one I'm aware of is this skeleton reconstruction. I think this was from, is it the Cleveland Shale? Something like that. It's the very upper part of the Devonian. I think they found this, the front half basically. But again, just the bones, not not be fun to run into one of those things. And to think of the mouth being able to open, you know, it's somewhat analogous to what a snake can do when it encounters something that is very tough for it to get its jaws around. The snake can disarticulate its jaws to get these things could open up to 180 degrees, smash down to slice through. So they would have had a real powerful initial punch. So they're probably coming in and hitting whatever they're trying to eat, giving it a big shearing bite, and then would probably wait for the thing to bleed out and then come in and finish it off and eat the rest.
Yeah.
Not have been a pleasant.
Those are, yeah, I still say that cage would have been
Not sufficient.
not sufficient. Mm-mm.
I think that they would have ripped that cage open and had all of them for dinner.
Yeah, those bars that would have been no problem for that thing to go through those bars.
Right through them, I think.
So what was your most incredible find over those 10 years?
Well, probably like, yeah, that one.
There's mine.
Or this thing. Just to find one of these, sort of, this was kind of like the holy grail of Iowa Devonian ammonoids, in that only 3 of them had ever been found. And to find this place, and, you know, now, you know, something that only 3 had been found in 150 years of collecting by all the famous geologists that used to be hunting around here. And, you know, all the club members have probably found 3 or more that went on these trips.
Yeah, because when I found this, I call, hey Jim, do they have ammonoids here? They do now.
So that would be my thing. Just because this is, again, such a rare specimen.
Yeah.
So now to know, and actually of the 3 that had been found, here, those 3 up in the upper left. The whiter one is from the Steve Miller quarry, which is one of the 3 quarries that we know is hard.
Oh, that's where that's from.
The other 2, one was found in Johnson County, one was found in Lynn County. I have tried to find both of those sites and cannot find them anymore. So the directions to the holotype say Solon, 5 miles east of, in Cedar River bank exposures. But this was in 1926.
Yeah.
So Solon is much bigger now than it was. Oh, did they mean 5 miles from the eastern edge, or 5 miles from the center, or, and, you know, were they on some road that goes out of town that's no longer there? But I've gone out, tried to find that site.
Yeah.
There's no exposure. I mean,
when I was doing the same thing that Jim was doing with the Ordovician early on, you would look in the literature and it would say this was found at Carpenter's Quarry.
Yep.
Okay. But Bill Carpenter or Fred Carpenter? Oh, it was a challenge. Jim knows this.
The other one on the lower left, it was found in Otter Creek Township in Lynn County. Townships are 6 miles on a side. So I can go to the old section maps and find Otter Creek Township, and there's quarries all over that township, old quarries on the map, but there's no telling which one it was found at. So you'd probably have to visit all of them, and who knows if they're accessible anymore or the exposures are still there. So basically, you know, the 2 on the left, those sites, you can't find them anymore. So that's, again, why this collection is so important, because now there's, you know, hundreds of these things instead of 3, and we know where the site is, and we have GPS coordinates. So even 100 years from now, somebody could punch in the GPS and go exactly to where we found these things.
So as you guys are driving down the road and you look around and you know there's a quarry over there and over there, and you just think about underneath me right now are all these fossils just waiting to be discovered, but there's no quarry, there's farmland. Does it drive you guys nuts?
Drives us insane.
Hmm.
So, especially driving in Independence, it's like, how many nautiloids are 100 feet under the road or 50 feet under the road or whatever. They're there. You just
Yeah, that's
and that just drives me crazy.
Yeah, but Jim, the worst one is how many of the nautiloids went through the crusher?
Right.
ugh.
That is even more, especially for me, because all my rock was not being saved because there were harsh features there. Mine were being shot and crushed. So I had to get in there and crack rock and get them out. And then literally 90%, maybe more, went to the crusher.
Yep. And if it weren't for the need for rock aggregate, we wouldn't have these quarries, but
Right.
so we wouldn't have found these things. The other frustrating thing in this case is that JS on the left side is a quarry the club can get into, but the deepest part in this quarry gets down to, let's see, there's the map here. So instead of going down to the red arrow at the bottom of this shaly tongue where the hard ground is, that Jessup quarry gets to the top part. So there's about 6 feet of this mudstone.
We lost sound.
So the mudstone is about 20 feet thick.
Jim, we seem to have lost sound.
Oh,
I can still hear.
I can hear him.
Catherine's frozen, but everybody else is. Are you there now? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. This mudstone
All right.
in the arrow there is about 20 feet thick.
That's fine.
And, the fossils are at the bottom of this mudstone, this 20-foot thick mudstone. And this Jessup quarry exposes the JS over here on the left, exposes the upper 6 feet of this mudstone. So they're literally like 15 or 14 feet above the interval where this hard ground would be. So if they ever actually deepen the quarry, they might cross this thing, but it's kind of frustrating to go in there and see this mudstone and go, man, if they would just blast another 15 feet down, this interval might be there. It may not, but it sure would be nice to know for sure. So
Yeah. Wow. That's a great presentation.
thank you for putting up with me.
Oh, it's easy. You could have gone on for a lot longer. It was awesome.
Knows I can ramble for hours, but
I'm gonna stop the recording. Go ahead and keep asking questions if you have questions, but I'm gonna stop the recording now.